is our book imprint brand. Click yes on that. Many of you know our Voices Together worship and song collection brand, and we've here at the in-person conference heard lots of singing, and hopefully you're tuning in as well for the worship sessions, learning lots of new songs from Voices Together. And then Shine is our children's curriculum brand. And in all we do, we are creating resources that call people to follow Jesus in word and deed. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about a few new Herald Press books. And if you in the chat at some point are interested in the slides from today's presentation, you can just type your email address into the chat or send it as a private chat just to me, and I will send you the slides. I'm not going to read all the text on each one of these, but I chose just a few new titles to let you know about as possible books to read or study in your congregation. And some of them that I chose, especially here today, have relevancy because we are in Alberta. So Jeremy Duncan is the author of Upside Down Apocalypse. This is a new book on Revelation and grounding the book of Revelation in the gospel of peace. And Jeremy Duncan is a pastor here in Alberta. And he draws on biblical scholarship and nonviolent theology to help readers glimpse a new vision of the book of Revelation beyond sort of the end times vision of doom and gloom that we sometimes and point to the end times through the book of Revelation. It's a challenging, provocative book. Many of you might have already read this one by Betty Priest, The Space Between Us, Engaging Conversations about Transforming Conflict. Betty Priest is a member of an MCEC congregation. This book came out last fall, and I know has been read and studied in a variety of circles. I think Betty does such a nice job of helping us talk about conflict and think through our responses to conflict, and guiding us toward ways of seeing discord as an opportunity for positive change. So that is The Space Between Us, came out last fall. The Land is Not Empty is another new book that came out last fall. Sarah Augustine wrote this book. She lives in the United States. And in this book, she unpacks the harm of the doctrine of discovery. And I know in Mennonite Church Canada congregations, dismantling the doctrine of discovery and understanding the doctrine of discovery has been tackled in a number of studies that you have done. Augustine is a Pueblo woman, and so she reframes colonization in North America as she investigates ways that the doctrine of discovery continues to devastate Indigenous cultures. So this is a very poignant and appropriate book for this time. This last book that I'll mention here is by Rohadi Nagasser, and he is a pastor in Calgary. And this is a book, When We Belong, Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins, Step into a Journey Toward Liberation, Belonging, and a Faith That Makes You Whole Again. So Rohadi brings the margins of Christianity to the center. And so what does it mean to read the gospel and to be the church for people who have been marginalized, rather than being the church and thinking about church from the perspective of the dominant culture? This book just got a really great review in Publishers Weekly, which is a magazine that reviews forthcoming books. I'm going to stop my share here. Arlyn is with us, and Arlyn is up next to talk a little bit about CommonWord and the partnership that we at MennoMedia share with CommonWord. I'll say these 4 books that I mentioned that are new titles from Herald Press are all available through CommonWord, and Arlyn will talk more about how all that works.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Amy. Sorry I'm a bit late, but I'm glad to join this conversation. I am Arlyn, and I'm the director at CommonWord, which is your bookstore and resource center at Mennonite Church Canada. Now let me just share my screen here for a moment. And I just need to... One way we share or collaborate together with MennoMedia is that congregation is through how we disseminate resources. MennoMedia, as Amy will have already described as our publisher, produces materials, trade books, and also curricula, and also periodicals. And CommonWord helps make those available as best we can within Canada. So, but sometimes there's a bit of a confusion perhaps, or I just wanted to clarify how that's best shaped within our context. So if your congregation is wanting to buy the Shine curriculum, wanting to buy, let's say, the Leader periodical or Rejoice devotional, those periodicals, that is done directly from and via MennoMedia. So it would be contacting MennoMedia directly for your Shine purchase or your Leader purchase subscription. Perhaps you've already purchased the Voices Together hymnal, but if your congregation has not and is considering that and needs to purchase over 25 copies, that too would be purchased directly from MennoMedia. CommonWord's role is to offer the curriculum and periodicals on loan, or to receive calls if there are questions about those kinds of materials. We want to be able to equip our congregations with what Shine is all about, or what the Leader magazine is features, etc. And so you can contact CommonWord for that. But again, as I said, if you want to purchase or subscribe, that would be done directly from MennoMedia. Voices Together hymnal in smaller quantities, under 25, we do ship those out and make available. So if you need one personal copy for at home, you could certainly talk with us, and we would get that to you. All of Herald Press titles, these are the trade book titles, which Amy just featured several. They're available for CommonWord to buy or to borrow. With the shipping as it is across the border, it's sometimes often to your advantage to buy them from CommonWord. Another way that MennoMedia, specifically Herald Press and CommonWord collaborate is through our Common Read program. So 3 times a year, we feature a specific Herald Press title, offering it as a discount for group studies. So if you purchase 5 or more, MennoMedia arranges an author interview, video interview, a live interview with an author that's available to view afterwards as well. It's a good opportunity to interact with the material via and through a conversation with the author. There is a free downloadable study guide, so this is really geared toward a group study potentially. And at CommonWord, these books are available to borrow in single copies as a way to preview it, to determine whether that's something a group of yours would want to pursue. So currently, now in spring and summer, the book about mental health, Not Quite Fine, is currently featured as our Common Read. In addition to having all the Herald Press titles to buy or borrow and the curriculum and periodicals to preview, CommonWord also gathers and curates and makes available literally thousands of additional Anabaptist and related resources that you may choose to buy or to borrow or to access online. As your national bookstore and resource center, our goal is to make these materials as accessible to you as possible through competitive retail pricing, free loan shipments across Canada both ways, and a growing inventory of free digital resources, now over 7,500. And we partner with many resource providers to make this possible. I invite you to explore our dynamic website, commonword.ca, if you haven't already oriented yourself to that. We have just released a new short video tutorial that gives kind of an orientation to some of its main features. And you can find that tutorial in the Help or About Us section of the website. But even more than collecting resources and making them available, our staff at CommonWord want to engage you in conversation. What types of resources are you looking for? What are the questions you or your congregation are asking? What are your recommended titles? What original resources might you have to share? We have tried to tailor our whole collection to the conversations we have had, and always are so grateful for your engagement with us. Amy, do you want to continue, or should I go on with some of the featured resources? I'm glad to do that.
You go on with your featured resources, and then I'll pick up with the tips for studying.
Okay, perfect. So I imagine that many of you may know Edith and Neil Van Gunten from their long ministry with Mennonite Church Canada, their work with Native ministries and Indigenous settler relations. Their recently published book, Walking Together, tells the intercultural story of their journey, the questions they engaged, and the communities that welcomed them. The book comes with a brief study guide, so it invites the church to grapple with questions of racism, Christian supremacy, and other questions they often faced in their ministry. And it challenges us to see all peoples and cultures as bearers of the Creator's beauty and gifts. Neil and Edith in this book really model an openness to such spiritual knowledge that crosses cultures and traditions. Their stories very purposely draw similarities between familiar biblical themes and concepts, and also the Ojibwe 7 way of life teachings. You may, again, borrow or buy this book through CommonWord. You may be interested in their book launch that we will host in the end of September, September 29th. It will be live streamed and also in person. CommonWord partners with a new leadership group called Together in Worship. We're grateful to be part of this partnership. Together in Worship is a binational leadership group that has gathered and is gathering free Anabaptist digital worship resources onto a new website, togetherinworship.net. And all of these same materials are also on CommonWord. And these include words for worship, as you see a call to worship on the screen, but it also includes music, video, audio, and visual art. And all of these materials have been curated, permissions have been secured, and so congregations can freely use these. About visual art, I want to introduce you to a significant new resource that will be made available in a few months in early fall. It's a 45-minute video documentary called A Creative God, the Visual Arts in Worship. And it explores how 6 congregations with worshipers from 2 or more cultural groups and how they have used visual arts in their worship spaces. It will be accompanied with a discussion guide for use in small group studies, worship committees, and other settings. Rebecca Slough from AMBS and Jerry Hossoppel with a team from EMU worked together on this project. And let me just share with you some of the learnings they found in their conversations, and learnings that other congregations I'm quite aware are also kind of seeking to learn. The visual art and visual elements of congregational life are tangible, engaged with the body in some way, and create a shared, storied place. Images, symbols, and colors significant for each culture communicate a feeling of respect and belonging. Another learning. People on the edges of the church have opportunities to contribute to the worship life of the congregation. Congregational art projects provide means for building relationships among congregational participants and create artwork that can be contemplated. helping congregations see who they are and what they are becoming. Congregational practices are enhanced, enriched, and changed through the presence and the use of familiar images and artifacts from cultures represented in the congregation. And finally, within congregations, we discovered that the visual arts create pathways to God. So this video documentary, very suitable for group conversation, offers an intercultural look at the role of visual art in worship places. And I highly recommend it when it becomes available in a few weeks. It'll be available through Together in Worship and also through CommonWord. A second new visual art resource that I want to talk about briefly was inspired by Pastor Ruth Beam from Faith Mennonite Church in Leamington, Ontario. On her recent sabbatical, she began the practice of photographing nature and contemplating what scripture passage might best fit the image. This opened both the Bible and creation to her in unique ways. Subsequently, this individual Visio Divina exercise has also been introduced to group settings. Ruth talks about a small group dispersing with their iPhones or their phones, smartphones, to take a few outdoor photos, then regathering and through a slideshow, brainstorming scripture passages together for each picture. And it became an inspiring communal biblical reflection. She's also used the same practice one-on-one as a way of encouraging another person to, in her words, see with their heart. Can we hear creation speak the biblical word? Can we take a photo and look at it long enough to hear it speak? Ruth will be at Amplify later this next week at the youth conference, introducing this same spiritual practice to the youth there. In addition to having some of Ruth's scripture photos available at CommonWord for your own personal meditation, you can print them off and use them as you wish. You might also be inspired to take up a camera yourself and make this a creative spiritual practice of your own. And we encourage submissions to our growing Visio Divina project. There is an online guide at CommonWord that explains the process. Simply look for the Visio Divina project. I want to also introduce you to these new resources. Mennonite Church Canada, in its Taking Action on Climate Change initiative, is in part encouraging the generation of new resources to share with each other as we face the climate crisis together. One body of materials has been recently contributed by Wendy Jansen, a pastor of Burning Bush Forest Church in Ontario and the eco minister at MCEC. She has shared Forest Church worship outlines for each month of the year and eco-spiritual practices on a variety of topics. We're also in the process of cataloging a collection of her prayers and poetry for different moments in the church year. These are rich textual resources that call us individually and congregationally to the earth, to creation, and to God, our Creator. Have you listened to the MennoCast? It's a relatively new podcast hosted by 3 pastors in Mennonite Church Canada, Moses Halko, Carrie Lane, and Ryan Duick. And they provide stimulating conversation about faith from an Anabaptist perspective. In recent episodes, they have talked about abuse, polarization, war, climate, racism, and theological topics as diverse as hermeneutics, systematic theology, music making in the church, and the church itself. As our nationwide structure has shifted toward local congregations as the hub of Christian ministry. The producers of this podcast, of which CommonWord is a part, see it as a way of connecting congregations together, listening to each other's voices, inviting others to join the journey. So I encourage you to give it a listen. Look for it on CommonWord, just search MennoCast, or you can Google MennoCast and or your podcast provider, and it should come up. And finally, I want to just briefly introduce you to a short video that will debut or premiere in our worship service tomorrow morning, Sunday morning. This new take on the gospel story from Luke 5, the calling of Peter and the disciples to fish for people, will be available for you to use in your own settings as well. It's my own personal film debut. I've done lots of biblical drama over the years on stage, but have never done that in front of a camera. So it was a fun experiment, and I welcome your comment and your feedback if you choose to watch it. I did find it a deep spiritual exercise of my own. Amy.
All right. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about how you put some of this stuff into practice. We've talked about all kinds of resources already and given you lots of ideas, but what do we do with it in terms of practice and making it useful and applicable in your congregation? We're going to start by talking about studying books. That is something that churches have done for a long time, and certainly continue to do so. I heard so many stories from congregations in COVID times about how meaningful book study groups were keeping people connected. I know for myself and in my own congregation, we had a group that sprung up. It was a women's group, and we met every other Saturday for over a year and read different kinds of books together. And that was a way that we stayed connected. We all know and have been part of book studies that are wonderful and enrich our faith and enrich our life. And we've all been part of those kinds of groups that are real sinkers, right? Where for one reason or another, whether it's people just aren't engaged in the topic, whether it's a leader who doesn't allow for sharing and you're just hearing the leader the whole time. There's lots of different reasons why book studies sometimes tank. So I put together just a little list here. And again, if you want the PowerPoint slides from today, just send me a chat or just put in the chat to all of us your email address, and I can send those on to you so that you can have some of these ideas. So number one, appoint a good leader. If you want to do a book study, a resource study in your congregation, make sure you get someone who's a good leader. When I talk a little bit more about children and families, I'll share some pretty sobering statistics there about the number of people willing to volunteer in churches right now. And it is massively on the decline since COVID. And I know we're all tapping out the same people in our congregations. That said, if you want a study, a resource study, a book study to be enriching, you do need to make sure you've got someone who's good at facilitating discussion, someone who's good at getting people to speak up, who isn't afraid to sit in silence and wait for other people to start to chime in. So appointing a good leader is the first one. In this age, increasingly, I know churches love church newsletters, and there are people who love church newsletters. There are lots of people who do not read the church newsletter. So for a resource study to really work these days, I think you need a promoter of some kind. So this could be someone who sends out emails to specific people in the congregation, promotes it kind of beyond that church newsletter, put together a little something who can, put together something about the book. It could be as simple as copying the descriptor from the CommonWord website, from our website, from Amazon, if it's not a book that CommonWord or Herald Press sell. But put something together, figure out how people in your congregation engage beyond the church newsletter and get it to them. Piggybacking on that, don't forget to send midweek reminders. I led a number of the weeks of this women's book group in my church. And even though it was every other Saturday morning at the same time, it made such a difference if there was a midweek reminder. Hey, by the way, we're going to study this book. Even if it's during the Sunday school hour, send that midweek reminder as well to get people to show up. Remind them of what they're reading. It reminds them of the assignment, and they can continue from there. Choose something that people are going to connect with. You know your congregations as pastors, as leaders, as participants. So make sure it's something that people are going to enjoy reading or find fulfillment in reading. Make sure you at least skim through it yourself first. Never choose something just because we need to choose one or we need to study something. Put some thought into it. And one way to do this could be to come up with 3 options for the group and have people in the group vote on which option they want to do. I'm one of the book groups I'm part of. We do this. And if it's your turn to pick, you choose 3 different titles, and then the book organizer sends out the paragraph descriptor. I think she just copies it from Amazon and the front cover image and sends it out to the 25 people in that book club. And then we all vote. And the one that gets the most votes is the one that we read. So talk with the group too about why the book is a good fit or why that one has been chosen for you to study together. Also, make a reading plan. So if you're facilitating this discussion, decide what will be read or talked about each week, or create a handout with the plan, or put that in your communication plan, in your church newsletter, however you want to do that. But make sure that everyone has access to the book, knows what they're supposed to be reading each week. It's super easy, to lose papers handed out at church. So come up with a couple different ways to get that out to people. I know some groups have had a lot of success with a closed Facebook group, depending on the age demographics in your congregation. But that would be an easy way to start. If people in your church are on Facebook or on a different social media platform, you could create a closed group where you could post what everyone's reading. You could ask people to post questions or things like that to keep people engaged, keep people connected. So that's another idea. Invite personal stories. That's a great way to keep people engaged, particularly in heavier books. Inviting specific people in the group ahead of time to share a personal story or example from their own lives that relates to that week's reading. Let's say you are reading Betty Priest's new book on conflict. You could ask everyone to share something about a conflict they've had in their lives. It could be a very simple conflict, it could be a more complex one. So I give an example here on baptism as well. So inviting in those personal stories provides great lead-ins to discussion, but it also helps those who maybe haven't done all the reading able to catch on and go from there. Certainly, you do want to encourage advanced reading. And reading through the chapter or the book, however you divide that up in advance, to give people time to reflect on the material, to bring their own questions or their anecdotes. For leaders, this is important because it helps you lead the discussion. Certainly mark or highlight passages you want to refer to as you prepare, or jot down page numbers on notes for the discussion. So if group comments lag, if you're facilitating it, you can always quote from one of your highlighted items in the book and simply ask people for their reactions. This is something that caught my eye. What did you all think about this part? You can always create a study guide. Now that is certainly takes a lot of work, and there are tons of free study guides out there for books. CommonWord has lots of them. For our Herald Press titles, we post free study guides for most of our titles online under heraldpress.com/study guides. So if there is a study guide out there, make sure to utilize it, or Google some questions on that topic to help you get some study tips together. This one, when I had first put together this handout with many similar ideas before COVID, it was simply find information on the author. But since COVID first came up, I got to tell you, authors are really eager to engage with book clubs, with book groups. And we have had many of our authors who have joined in on Sunday mornings with Sunday school classes via Zoom or things like that to be able to talk about their book. I did put in here a tip. Make sure to offer an honorarium or let the author know how many copies were purchased. I heard a story some years ago about a particular author who was invited to speak in a Mennonite congregation, and the author said yes, and had brought books to sell, and afterward wasn't selling any books because everyone who came and seemed eager, they were all just going to share that same one copy out of the church library. Or maybe they were getting it, Arlyn, from you at CommonWord. But selling books is how an author makes money. And so make sure that if you're not buying a lot of copies, make sure you're offering that author an honorarium for their time. There's lots of ways you can do that. And if you're reading like a book by a more public author, often authors give information about themselves on their website. And just building that connection, I think, is something that helps people feel engaged in a book discussion in a congregation. All right, I'm going to move on and talk about families and tips for connecting with families in your congregation. But before I share those tips on the screen, I'll talk about a few other things. So when Arlyn and I first started talking about this workshop in April, I had suggested, we really need to include some tips for families because I had just been part of two significant events with important information on churches and children's faith formation. It's leaving me as a publisher at MennoMedia wrestling with all kinds of questions of where do we go from here? And I'm sure you're facing that in your own congregations. In April, the Hartford Institute released a report called Religious Education During the Pandemic, a tale of challenge and creativity. And I just love that because that's what it was in my own congregation. I'm a parent of two children. They were in first grade and third grade when the pandemic began, and challenge and creativity was the name of the game in all of our congregations, in all of our families as everything moved online. Now, that Hartford Institute report is centered on U.S. congregations, but over meals and talking in the hallways these last few days and hearing about what's happening in congregations that are represented here in person, I think the trends are much the same. So I'll share a few key findings from this Hartford report. They found that virtual religious education did not work well for children, though it had benefits in adult education efforts. Their analysis showed that congregations that closed their Sunday school programs completely for any length of time, could have been a short period or a longer period, but they took a break, have showed the greatest decline in involvement once they restarted. That churches that moved religious education online lost a higher percentage of participants than churches who just modified their efforts with safety protocols, but basically continued meeting in person as much as possible. And just prior to the pandemic, average U.S. church attendance was 65. And as of March this year, it's 50. And the median is at 75. So to me and the U.S., this is signaling that people haven't been coming back. I see these trends reflected in my own congregation as well. And not surprisingly, smaller churches, meaning those with under 100 attendees, have been the most likely to report both not having children and youth programming coming back the way they wanted it to, as well as discontinuing children and youth programming. Now, we know that throughout the pandemic, many congregations have struggled to cultivate consistent and reliable volunteers for ministry programming. One pastor said to me yesterday, it is so hard to find volunteers. It's the same people right now, and they are burning out. And that's something we all really need to pay attention to in our congregations. Overall, volunteering has been significantly down since the pandemic, from roughly 40% of people in a congregation volunteering in very early 2020 to only 20% in March 2022. So that means the number of your volunteer pool in your congregation has halved in the last 2 years. So it's not surprising then that 57% of churches say that they are having volunteer challenges in their Christian education programming. Overall, children's participation, they are showing, is down about 30%, and youth involvement is down about 40%. So I put all these statistics here from Hartford Institute out there to just say the Sunday school model has changed. And increasingly, I believe that families are key to the future of faith formation. So how you stay connected to the families in your congregation, I think, is very important. Now, at MennoMedia, we produce and sell children's Sunday school curriculum called Shine. And so what I'm saying here doesn't mean you shouldn't still support Shine and try and use Shine in your congregation, but rather I think that at this point in time, we also need to be thinking about families in some different ways than we had been. So rather than just offering Sunday school, maybe as you did before the pandemic, because that does work for some families, you also now need to offer helps for parents who, for one reason or another, just aren't coming back. And maybe it's yet or just aren't coming back, period. Certainly, families are evaluating what seems meaningful in this time, and they're trying to figure out if church is part of that. I think we all know that spiritual education should be a contingent kind of relationship. This past week, I read a book by Andrew Root, who is a seminary professor at Luther Seminary, and he writes this: all of life is built on relationships, and relationships are therefore contingent. Plants do not grow without sun, soil, and seed. The seed comes about because of a bud and a bee. Our faith does not exist on its own, but in relationship. I really like that. And I think that speaks to Anabaptist faith formation as well. So in this same vein, we know that children learn about religious beliefs and practices by listening to the words and tones that others use to talk about God, by observing how religious people act, by asking questions and coming up with their own answers of those who have proven to be reliable religious informants in their lives. Children are heavily dependent on the willingness of adults to demonstrate religious belief and practice in moral sensibilities, if we want moral sensibilities to become understandings in them. So I'm going to share a few slides here with some ideas for reaching families in your congregation. So idea number one, I just have 5 ideas here for connecting with families. Number one, use the right language. Early in the pandemic, we were saying to parents, you need to do this religious education with children. And we started talking about, parents being the teachers of religious education. And I think many parents found that to be overwhelming. And theologically, when you step back to think of it, really what we want to do is journey together. We want to imagine together. This language of the parent passing on the faith isn't fresh or correct theologically. So we want to use familial language and flatten that teacher-child distinction. That's going to empower the parents in your congregations and in your context to think about faith formation in some fresh ways and not as another chore that they have to do and impart to their children. Make sure in working with parents that you are connecting with the right platform. Provide nurture for families specifically via text, phone, or email. That's what parents are paying attention to. They're not reading necessarily the church newsletter. So perhaps you could do like a weekly e-blast to parents with one prayer for families or one easy idea, maybe a closed Facebook group for parents or group text once a week to just say to parents, prayed for all the families today. So connect with parents, but know the right platform. Make sure that you are trying to connect with your parents if you can once a week beyond the church newsletter. Number 3, encourage ritual. Parents are taught the importance of ritual for babies at bedtime, or, when babies wake up, they eat first and then they do this. So, all the new parenting books talk about the importance of ritual. So how do you as pastors, as church leaders, as people in the pew, as parents, how do we encourage faith rituals in families? What care do we take to the habits of faith? So one tip for connecting with families would be to come up with one ritual for the families in your congregation to do together. So, encouraging all families in the congregation to pray for other families in the church before a particular meal that week, or encourage all the families in your church to offer up 5 thanks for things at bedtime, or to say a blessing over each other. There's a power in ritual in individual families, but there's also power in ritual in knowing that it's not just your family that's doing that ritual, but all the families in your congregation. Again, keep it very simple. You're not trying to give parents more to do, but to build faith together. Tip number 4, provide access to the biblical story. And put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and make sure your families have age-appropriate story Bibles, whether you're giving not story Bibles, but just a regular Bible to kids, let's say in 3rd or 4th grade, whether you're using the Shine On or another story Bible for children in elementary school or younger. I have a picture here of our great big love, God's story for you and me. Our Shine curriculum has a new Bible story book each year. It's illustrated. The story in this book is told in 2 ways every year. Each quarter of curriculum is 13 weeks. So this book, Great Big Love, is for 3 quarters of the year, fall, winter, spring. So it has 39 Bible stories in it that match the stories in our Shine Sunday School. It can be used with the Shine Sunday School and is used with Shine Sunday School, but it's also a great standalone. And each story is told twice so that right there in Great Big Love, you have that week's text printed directly from Scripture, and then you have another version that's told in a condensed, age-appropriate way for children. And both versions have some illustration. So that is a great option for congregations, that if you're trying to figure out how do I connect with families, make sure that if you want to build biblical knowledge with your families, that you are providing for your families some kind of Bible story. And tip 5 is to encourage questions. We need to reframe what it means to learn effectively. I think letting kids and parents ask questions and honor their questions. One of the goals, I think, of faith formation is to spark curiosity, because when we ask questions and make those connections for ourselves, that's, I think, when real learning happens. So this piece here is to let go of the need to provide answers. I think this fosters a community of belonging. So encouraging reciprocal questions, meaning children can ask parents questions and vice versa. And, if you're sending something out for families in your congregation, or just, 1 tip a week for families to do faith formation at home, it could simply be a prompt of sharing, asking questions, some question prompts. What stood out to you in this story? Which character are you in this story, et cetera. But putting some questions in for parents to consider alongside kids so that everyone is asking questions together. And Arlyn, I turn it back to you.
Thanks, Amy. From that good introduction of Christian formation in the home and in the family, in a church, to a conversation briefly here about finding worship helps. Worship, of course, is a Christian formation practice as well. And let me just briefly demonstrate kind of a live demonstration of from our website, because CommonWord has many worship resources. And as I said before, so does Together in Worship. So just give me a moment here. Here is our website. You may well be familiar with it. And I just want to very briefly show you what some of the features. So in our keyword search up at the top, it's important to know that all of our worship and also our education resources are cataloged by scripture reference. So obviously you're planning a worship service typically around a scripture passage. And so this is a great place to start also your search. So I'm just going to randomly John 4, verse 10. And just show you that there's 87 different resources, including a worship resource that likely that's probably what it's referencing here in the Leader magazine, which is the MennoMedia resource. And to be aware of the filters on the sidebar. Here you can narrow your search in many different ways. As I said before, there are items to buy, there's items to borrow, items, digital items that you access online. There's some audio resources, video resources, mostly print resources in this case. Group study under genre, this would be an educational worship resource, but there are complete worship services, worship anthologies, Bible commentaries, and so on that would be helpful perhaps in your worship planning. Under expression, there are sermons. Dramatic multi-voice readings, one-voice readings, responsive readings, and etc. You can look more specifically at theme or topic, or the church season. So if you were planning for the Advent season or the Christmas season and so on, and it shows the full the full calendar. In addition to, if you're following the lectionary, there may be very lectionary-based resources that would be helpful. You may be looking for children's resources for worship, for instance, under audience, or you may be looking for resources in another language other than English, etc. You may be looking for MennoMedia resources in particular, and so on. So the filter allows you to look at these 87 results in a more refined way. An alternative to this is our navigation bar. And so under books and resources, you see the various different options. And these are just very, very brief. These are select options. There are others, but this gives you a very high level view of the website. And so if you're looking for worship resources, again, under genre, you could choose parts of worship. By doing that, you have here a very long list, 2,700 items that are worship-related items. And here again, you can use the filters to look further. If you're looking for video for worship, a visual piece in worship, and so on. Complete worship services, and then the individual components of worship, like a call to worship. There are many of those, etc. Again, all the same different kinds of categories you can look at under the church season and so on, and narrow your searches that way. Together in worship, I said we partner. So of these, what did I say, 2,700 or so, 1,700 of those are shared with Together in Worship, and these would all be online. So just very briefly here I will switch over to the Together in Worship website, just so that you see and compare. If I do the John 4 verse 10 reference, you get their results, and you have the same filters here. So you would search them the same way. They're presented a little differently, so you can see at a glance some of the kind of the first part, a preview of each resource. So that's a simple way of accessing either of our websites and finding resources that are available for your worship planning. Amy, did you have more to add?
I will just share a couple things from the Voices Together website as well. I think if you stop sharing first, Arlyn. The name of the game here today is resource. And CommonWord is full of resources, MennoMedia is full of resources, and feel free to reach out to either one of us about resources. I'm happy to direct you where you need to go. He's happy to direct you our way, etc. So on the Voices Together hymnal.org website for churches that use Voices Together, just know that there are endless resources here. And I'm just going to share a couple here at the top resource page. You just go to voicestogetherhymnal.org and click on resources that as a worship leader in my own congregation, I find tremendously helpful. So my top favorite resource to recommend is this one right here, streaming license information for Voices Together. I know many congregations continue to live stream, and there's different copyrights needed, permissions for streaming. And so when you click here to view this resource, it just takes you to a Google Doc. This Google Doc, I cannot say enough good words about. It was created by Anna-Lee Thiessen and Katie Graber, two of the participants on the Voices Together committee. And look at this fabulous chart. I mean, every single song in Voices Together is here, and it tells you what the text description should be, what the music description should be, and then where do you find that song? What license is it? As you know, if you ever are looking up licenses on CCLI or One License, sometimes a song can be listed under a number of different ones, and you aren't sure which is this one that we're singing here in my church. This is a fabulous resource for that. And Katie and Annalee have combed through CCLI and one license to give you the right numbers of exactly what you need, or if it's public domain. Certainly, there are some songs that you need to contact the copyright holder directly, but you can just see here how helpful that would be. So 2 thumbs up for Katie and Annalee on that one. Another question that we get asked often at MennoMedia is, I want to project the art that's in Voices Together. I want to make some handouts with that art. Contact information for the visual artists is right here on this as well. Additional reference notes for people who are worship leaders, music leaders. These additional reference notes are awesome. This is a big PDF that has information on so many of the songs that talks about, I'm just going to scroll to one here. So this song here, Jesus Lord, How Joyful, the English name, it talks about this Cheyenne spiritual song, how it came together. For many of the songs, there's this background note, and this is all just free on the website, so you can find that. For churches that are still being introduced to Voices Together, there are curricula and discussion guides right here. If you're looking for new songs to introduce, there are guides for how to do that on here as well. The teaching videos are something that I have really enjoyed from Voices Together, and there's a playlist, etc. So there's just so much here under resources that I'm not going to get into today because it could take all day. But just an encouragement to make sure to check out that resources page. Maybe you want to find a new song and see if there's a YouTube video recorded for that you could play in your congregation, and what would the permissions for that be, et cetera. So that resources page just has so much for you to unpack and use. That's what I have to say on that. And I think now we turn it over to you all for questions, for comments. What resource helps do you need in your congregation? Or pushback on anything we said. Challenge us on our ideas for you too. Well, while people aren't talking, I will fill the silence with one more resource idea. You know, I talked about book studies and how to do some book studies, and I was kind of gearing my comments, more than kind of, I was gearing my comments toward adult book studies. But don't forget about a kids book study option. I mean, that's another great idea and way to get people in your congregation invested. There's a Mennonite Church conference in the United States called Central Plains Mennonite Church. And Shanna Peachy-Boshart used to be their Minister of Faith Formation for that conference. And she put together this program called Shalom Readers, helping children and adults choose the Jesus way of peace. And Melissa, you had mentioned peace as a key component of Anabaptist faith formation. So there's a great book list here. And if you just search for Shalom Readers Mennonite, you'll find this list. There's a great book list for kids of different ages, of age-appropriate books. And then she has this great list here of creative responses. So you can journal, draw, make collage, etc. And I had started a Shalom. I live in the United States, but I'm not part of a Central District congregation. I live in Ohio and I'm part of Ohio Conference, but I started a Shalom Readers book club in my congregation ahead of COVID. And the first book we read was a graphic novel called El Defo. And I think that's now an Apple TV program. And I chose that particular book. It was on the list from Central Plains, and I chose it because the author happened to be a graduate of a local Ohio university. And we had a great time with it. And we did 3 books, and then COVID came. So even just reviewing these tips that I put together for book studies reminds me that I should get that kind of program going, because that was something that children in our congregation really enjoyed.
I might just add too that congregations that want to also access CommonWord resources but don't know where to start can certainly call, email, contact us. If they want to receive on loan a sampling of materials, 12 different titles, as a way to determine what they want to buy, or just be inspired, that program, Cheaper by the Dozen, is also available to you. I'm glad to talk about that. It's a way of sharing resources in the congregation, generating interest in reading, and discerning what books and other resources might be most helpful. And glad to talk further about that too. We're glad for your comments in the chat. Thank you. And as we both have said, it's really a conversation, and we would love to be in touch. Both what you're already doing, what you yearn to be doing, and also as you contemplate what to do. I think there are materials aplenty, and but there's also places for that we all are also always discerning what best to put forward and to publish and to make available. So
yeah, the lack of resources isn't a problem. You know, I think it's really figuring out what works best in your congregation with the group of people that God has given you and your church to love, and the changing realities of who's coming and who's volunteering and some of those things.
Yeah.
Well, let's, okay, go ahead, Mennonite Church Canada.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you so much for sharing today. And I'm sorry that there's somehow a feed loop issue, I think, in getting people into this session. So we will be putting the recordings up, and thank you both so much for your presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, goodbye, everyone.
Yeah, goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.
We'll talk again.
Yeah.